So our very first speaker today is Mandy Froehlich, and Mandy is an educator, a consultant, and a former director of innovation and technology who specializes in sustainable technology integration, resource alignment, and change leadership. She is also the author of multiple books supporting educator well-being and engagement, including The Fire Within and Divergent EDU. Mandy brings a rare balance of systems, thinking, and human care, which is exactly what AI leadership requires. Without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring up my friend, Mandy Froehlich. All right, Mandy, go ahead, share your screen, and such a beautiful walk-up song. I love it.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Actually forgot about that. So that's pretty funny.
Sorry about that. My computer's going bonkers. Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay, there we go. Okay, my bad. Go ahead, Mandy.
Yeah, mine's giving me a little trouble too. Zoom is not being friendly to me this morning. So there we go. Can you guys see the presentation?
Yeah, we got you.
All right, awesome. All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate you popping in for just the AI Ignite in general, but also then my session. And I've done this session a few times. It's the we don't have AI guidelines and need help session. I don't know how to be more clear about what this is about, but this is something I've been pretty passionate about for probably the last year and a half, and making sure that not only making sure that we understand why it's important to have AI guidelines, but also understanding why people aren't creating them. But this is such a huge new thing in education for us to be dealing with. Like, what is stopping people from going ahead and creating those guidelines? And of course, when I ask that, the first thing people say is time. And of course, yes, right? Like, that time is always an issue. But I actually think it's a little deeper than that. And so that's something that I want to talk a little bit about today. There we go. Okay. As Sarah said, my name is Mandy Froehlich. I am the proud COO of EduMatch for, it's like getting pretty close to 10 years now. I think it's getting close. It's not quite there, but for quite some time, I've been working with one of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Sarah Thomas. So I'm super fortunate to be able to do that. I'm also the director of professional learning at a company called Tech. I'm a former educator, author, and consultant, and also was a director of innovation and technology for a district for a time. So I've kind of, like a lot of us, have run the gamut on positions that I've had. Excuse me. And so you can find some more of my stuff at www.mandyfroehlich.com. There, what you're going to find is more of a focus on human sustainability than AI, but I do have a lot of resources on there that you're welcome to. So we're going to start first with some statistics. So as a whole in education, where are we with policy and guidance? So 34 states have issued guidance or policy on the use of AI in schools. That's of October 25th, October 2025. That is getting close to 6-ish months out from there. We have a few more that are in the process of doing so. So we have over half of the states have issued some sort of guidance on that. According to RAND in 2025, and this was like the spring of 2025, and that's important because things are moving so quickly, right? So this could have changed, but trying to give you guys a kind of a timeline on this. 45% of principals in a report that they did reported having school or district policies or guidance on the use of AI in schools, and 34% of teachers reported having school or district policies on the use of AI in relation to academic integrity. So again, that was in 2025. So like, policies and guidelines are different. Policies tell you to me, policies are like rules. They tell you what not to do. Guidelines are more like norms telling you what to do. So that is, or what's acceptable and what's not. So I think they're a little bit different. So this doesn't break it down into what districts have policies and what districts have guidelines, but it does give us at least the idea that it's only 45%. It's not 95% or 98% where we probably should be. And then EdSurge in December of 2025, so a little bit more recent, said 60% of schools have no guidance on AI usage. and rely on teacher discretion. And so that still sounds like it's still pretty close, right? Like between those two, the data is dataing. I do think that I hear this a lot when I talk to schools that don't have guidance, is they say we're relying on our teachers to make those decisions. I think that is a very dangerous spot to put teachers in, because what that essentially says is we are waiting for our teachers to screw up so we know where to start. And I think that is not a good policy for districts to have. We want to make sure that in providing and supporting our teachers and our students in our districts, we want to make sure we're being proactive with this, and actually not having guidance at this point is still being reactive. Like, we need to get on top of things, and we need to make sure that we are trying to be as proactive as possible and not putting teachers and students in a place where they don't know what to do. And so they do what they think is best, and then that ends up being a problem. So we don't want to put people in that spot. And so I have a theory. So after talking to lots and lots of districts and people as to why they don't have guidance, of course, they say the number one thing is time, right? It takes time to get committees together to talk about what they want and all of these types of things. But I think that the bigger issue is that the people who are typically in charge of creating guidelines and policies aren't usually your technology people. They are usually your people in districts who are, maybe they're even your curriculum people or your business people or your superintendents, depending upon the size of your district. And they're not necessarily going to understand AI. And so my theory is actually that the reason why people back off from creating guidance isn't because they don't want to create guidance. It's because they don't understand enough about AI in order to be able to create the guidance. Like, they don't feel equipped to be able to do that. And at this point, with AI being such a big thing, it's very possible that if we think about the human in the loop, like, it's very possible that they feel bad about that, or embarrassed, or maybe don't want to admit that they don't know enough about AI in order to be able to create those guidelines. On top of that, it's also, when we're talking about bringing in other stakeholders, if we're creating AI guidelines, we should be talking about bringing in students and bringing in teachers and bringing in parents and all of the stakeholders. Then we're also dealing with more people who may have either a complete misunderstanding of what AI is. A lot of people in the community equate AI with robots, and that's scary to them. And so we might be dealing with more people who just either completely misunderstand AI or just don't know a lot about it. And so what I think is, when we go to create AI guidance, we need to make sure that we are starting at the very foundation, like the simplest skills. I've sat in on some other types of organizations, AI guidelines, creation type things. And they always start out, they jump into the guidance. They jump into get your stakeholders together, talk about student integrity, talk about what teachers are doing. They don't back up enough to get everybody on the same page in order to be able to create those guidelines. In this presentation, I'm going to ask you to pick a mindset to go into this presentation with. Usually I say, maybe you're a newbie. Take it all in. Like Sarah said, we've all started at different spots, right? Maybe you're this person that I'm talking about, that you're just not feeling comfortable with AI, and it's something that you don't feel like enough about. That, like, you're in the right spot. I have some foundational information for you that we're going to go through, and you're just going to take it all in. The second type of mindset is you feel like you know a lot about AI, or maybe you're even a pro. What I need you to do is I need you to think like a newbie. A lot of people who are very comfortable with AI right now are your people who are typically comfortable with technology. It's something that comes naturally to them. They understand that they can push buttons and things aren't going to explode. They're willing to take those technology risks. But what I want you to think about when you think about working with schools who need to create guidance is, I want you to think about a time that you had to learn something that was not natural to you. that was very unnatural. Maybe it's something like I'm not a very crafty person. If I ever had to learn how to do something like knit, I would have a lot of work to do. I'd have to figure out about yarn, and I think there's sticks involved in knitting, and sometimes I see them rolling balls. I literally know nothing about knitting. And so I would have to learn all of the terms about knitting, so I even knew the right questions to ask before I would even learn how to start knitting. And then frankly, I would stink at it for a little while until I kept practicing and learning more. And excuse me, I need you to think about a time that you learned something new that was not necessarily a strength of yours. And think about what you had to do in order to get to the place where you even knew how to ask the right questions. Okay. And so I want you to look at this presentation like that. All right. I was just checking the chat there. Thanks everybody for piping in. Try to keep my eyes on it. Okay, so step one in creating guidelines is to level set. It is to get everybody on the same page. So you have, at this point, you have created your team, and you have your committee, and you know who's going to be on it, and you are aware that you need some people from all of the different type of stakeholders in order to do this. And the first thing you want to do is level set. I am in full support of districts creating their teams with students and parents. If you're creating your teams with students and parents, this is going to be especially important. This is going to be critical in those spaces to level set. So you're going to want to have somebody on the team that is strong in AI so that they can do this for them. So the next little bit of information is some of that information that you can provide in order to provide that level setting. So again, if you are a pro, this is some of that foundational information. This is how far back you have to go, or how foundational you have to go in order to be able to get everybody on the same page, okay? For newbies, this is going to be some of the very, very, like the beginning pieces of your foundation. This is where you learn what the yarn sticks are called and what the different types of yarn is. This is what this part is. So AI in education, like Sarah said, it's not new. We have been using AI in education for a very long time. And the reason why this knowledge is important is because it takes some of the fear away from generative AI, because what scares people is it's the robots, right? It's the idea that robots are going to take over the world and AI. I was recently telling Sarah that I read an article that they feel like at this point, a Claude is about 11%. What's the word, Sarah? 11% like not conscious,
Sentient?
but yes, sentient, thank you. They estimate, and they're now creating a ethics committee in order to figure out what to do about that. That's the thing people are scared of. But in education, we've been using AI for a very long time. Sarah said back in the 90s, she was doing different things with AI. And the 90s to 2000s, we had spell check, we had grammar checkers, basic recommendation systems. When I taught, my students were using adaptive systems in order to get them content that was specific to them. And that was even before the 2010s, but in 2010s, we had those adaptive learning platforms, things like Khan Academy, IXL, plagiarism checkers. A lot of those used AI. And then now in the 2020s, again, we have the generative AI, which would be things like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Magic School AI, Claude, so all of those types of things. So the generative AI is, of course, the thing that's causing the most disruption right now. So what does AI do exactly? AI analyzes data and performs tasks that mimic human intelligence. And so this is really important for students to understand, because generative AI does sound like a human, but it's not doing that, right? Like it is predicting what you want to hear when it is creating the output that it gives you. So the key difference between traditional AI and generative AI is that traditional AI recognizes patterns, it makes predictions, Generative AI will create something completely new. So it's going to create new content, text, images, video, music, but it's all based on a data set that it's been fed. If we think about traditional AI, for example, like spell check will detect errors, right? But generative AI can write entire essays. So if you're thinking about the difference between like your spell check in a Google document versus actually using ChatGPT or Gemini to create something new. Generative AI works by processing massive data sets. And AI studies the text, images, and patterns, and it takes a look at that and decides what the output is going to be from that. Some of the massive data sets, some of the problems with using AI and privacy is that when we put student data or any kind of PII into something like ChatGPT, ChatGPT is then taking that information and it is feeding it back into the massive data set. So when we talk about PII and it's such a big deal, that's why it's a big deal. That's why we shouldn't be putting PII in there. Because if we say ChatGPT, it's grabbing from that data set from everybody, this massive data set. And if we're putting that information in there, we're feeding the data set. Now, some of the products like Gemini or Magic School AI, they can lock down what's being fed into that data set so it just stays within your district. And so that is better. But that is one of the reasons why when people talk a lot about PII and they talk about privacy with things like ChatGPT, that's what they're talking about, and that's what the problem is. Let's see, generative AI recognizes relationships in data. And so it learns how words, concepts, and visuals all connect together. It predicts what comes next. It forecasts the most likely response based on training data. And also it creates content. So it generates new text, images, and ideas based on user output. On some simple generative AI terms that everybody should know, LLMs, prompt engineering or prompting. I think teaching people who are going to create guidelines how to prompt engineer is important because it helps them understand how it works a little bit better in order to be able to create those guidelines, and then also output. When we're talking about those, we have large language models. So that is AI that is trained on massive text data sets to generate human-like responses. These are what we've been talking about with generative AI. So like the Gemini, the ChatGPT, the Copilot, those are all the large language models. Prompt engineering or prompting, I've literally done entire day-long workshops on prompting. Like it's such an important part of using AI and understanding AI. So again, understanding this piece in order to be able to create those guidelines. It's the art of designing inputs to guide AI's responses. I've been saying for years now that when we talk about how AI is going to change education, I've been saying it's going to change education from people who know the answer to people who know how to ask the right questions, because that's what prompt engineering is, right? It's the ability to ask the right questions. And then we have output. So the output is the AI generated text, image, or content based on a given prompt. I can tell you that for people who struggle with understanding tech, some of these very simple definitions are really difficult for them. And for me, the idea of input, like a prompt, and output always made sense to me because it reminded me of coding. Like you code something, you have input, and what it spits it out is output. I don't know if that's from being like an 80s baby where we had to input, like the only thing that would come up on our computer the first time is like a word with a little caret going to the side, and we had to input something to get a program started. I don't know if that's why it makes sense to me, but that like input and output makes sense to a lot of people where technology makes sense. But these are very difficult concepts for people that aren't really technology savvy or really understand technology. So it just means you need to be very clear about it. Another thing that you could give people in order to help them understand generative AI a little bit better is the Google Gen AI course. The course focus is like AI's role in lesson planning and things, but it really does start from the beginning and it gives a lot of background information. So this course would be a really great thing to level set everybody who would be on a team to create these guidelines so that they understand what AI's role is in lesson planning, how it can be used to give feedback, how it generates text. If you have a team where nobody is really comfortable with providing those foundational skills, this would be a really great place to start. So Sarah, would you mind throwing that thank you so much. We'll throw that into the chat so that you guys have access to that. But again, it's just a great place to start. Okay, so step 2 is determining priorities. So we want to make sure that we understand before we get started creating these guidelines, like as a district, what are our priorities? Okay, what is it that is really important to us as we create these guidelines? And if you have obviously a team of different stakeholders, they're all going to have different valuable priorities. So understanding how to pick out what is going to go into these guidelines is going to depend upon how you understand generative AI. And for competing priorities, I think that a great place to start is to really, if you need to back up even more, determine what is it that you want AI to be able to accomplish in your district, okay? Level set on that first. Get everybody in agreement, maybe 1 or 2 sentences. What is it that you want everybody to be, like, what is it that you want AI to be able to accomplish in your district? And then start working on your priorities from there. So why is it important that we even have AI guidelines? Like, why does it even matter? Again, I'm going to go back to that. If we are waiting for teachers to do something that they have to be talked to about, or for lack of a better term, the teacher screws up doing the best that they can, and then we have to go back and we have to set guidelines because of that. That is putting your teachers in a really unfair position to be making decisions about things that they may not understand entirely, and then creating guidelines on a gotcha system. Like, we don't want that. We want people to feel comfortable moving forward with AI and really understanding what their guardrails are, okay? So that's really important. We don't want to work on a gotcha system for teachers ever, or students for that matter. AI is powerful and it needs to be used ethically and responsibly. We need to make sure that we're not creating serious problems like privacy risks. We want our students to understand misinformation and bias and all of those things that go along with AI. Clear guidelines will prevent misuse. It will at least provide people information that they need to be able to identify bias in the AI output, and also to understand privacy violations. I can tell you that I have worked with districts with teachers who have been using generative AI for a while, that when I tell them that when they put PII into ChatGPT, that it feeds the data set, their whole face goes, oh my gosh. They've done it a million times. They didn't understand why it was a problem. Now all of a sudden they do. And so these guidelines help prevent those types of errors. We're going to be taking a look at one district that follows 9 core principles to guide AI use, and we're going to be looking at them in a second. That is the Philadelphia School District. I've worked with the Philly School District for, I think, going on 7 years now. They really try to be on top of things when it comes to AI. They have a really fantastic technology department. So we're going to take a look at the guidelines that they came up with in just a minute. Why does the absence of guidelines matters? When the absence of guidelines matters, expectations vary by classroom. In the very simplest form, we've talked about this before when it comes to gum. Okay, so like you have a student, they go to first hour, they're not allowed to chew gum, so they're not chewing gum. They go to second hour, they're allowed to chew gum, so they're chewing gum. They go to third hour, they're not allowed to chew gum, but they walk into third hour with the gum from second hour. And what happens? They get in trouble, right? Because expectations are not set across the school. Now, that's just a really simple example, but it's the same thing. We would not want, as teachers, to have expectations by 8 different people that are all different depending upon what hour of the day we're teaching in, right? That would be, it's impossible for anybody to be able to work under those conditions. And yet we ask students to do that all the time. And so we really want to make sure that our expectations when it comes to something as serious as generative AI, especially, that they are the same across classrooms. If it doesn't matter if a student's going to first hour, fourth hour, sixth hour, eighth hour, the expectations for AI are all the same. If we don't have guidelines, students and teachers received mixed messages, and conversations sound more like, I've tried this, might move into kind of that ask forgiveness later type thing. We don't want that when it comes to AI and privacy and stuff like that. We want to make sure that people feel supported so they don't feel like they have to try something and ask forgiveness later. Also, staff make risk decisions on their own. Again, I've talked about this a few times. We don't want staff to be put into a place where they are making risky decisions. We want to make sure that they have the information that they need to make the right decisions. And then also equity gaps widen. So if you have a bunch of teachers, you have a student who just happens to have a bunch of teachers who refuse to use AI or are using it in ways that are not necessarily following what guidelines would be there, you're teaching, like some students aren't getting access to the teaching that they need to in order to know how to use AI, and those equity gaps just widen even more than they already might be. So what should AI guidelines clarify? They should clarify purpose and boundaries. So we want to make sure that the purpose, like what do we want AI to accomplish in our district, that purpose, but then also the boundaries, the guardrails, right? What can and cannot be done with it. Any instructional implications. We want teachers to be very clear about how they can use it in the classroom and how they shouldn't use it. Any operational and ethical safeguards. So again, going back to that PII a little bit, and then the needs and expectations for all stakeholders from the district's lens. So from the stakeholders' lens for the district. So when we talk about students, like what are their needs? What are their expectations? In that same RAND survey that was done, 80% of students said that they were given no type of expectations or guidance or learning when it comes to the use of AI. So 80% of our students are reporting that they were never taught how to use AI. It doesn't mean that they don't use it. It just means they were never taught how to use it. So when we're saying like students are cheating, students are doing this, students are doing that, were they taught how to use it? Because if they weren't, they're going to use it in any way they can figure out how to use it, right? So we really need to make sure that we're listening to the needs and expectations for all the stakeholders when we're creating these guidelines. So just some guidelines for consideration, like some things that you could think about when creating some of these guidelines. Human oversight and educator autonomy, like keeping the human in the loop. That's so important. And a lot of times I go to districts, and I was working with a district in California that they had a group of people from their district in my workshop who truly believed that AI was going to take their jobs. And they were pretty upset about the use of AI and even being taught it and all of those kinds of things because of that. But my feeling is that if we are doing AI the way we should do AI, there will always be a human in the loop. There will always be oversight by a human. And especially when it comes to educators, educators come into education obviously with this huge, vast amount of knowledge and understanding of how students learn and what humans need. AI is never going to be able to replicate that. And so like things that AI should never be doing, and these should be clear in your guidance, in your guidelines, is AI should never be able to make final decisions about students. Always thinking about AI as making recommendations if that's what we need, but it's never making the final decisions. Educators should have full control over AI generated content and recommendations. AI tools should augment, not replace teacher expertise ever. Okay, it is there as a thought partner. It is there as potentially helping to provide feedback or create instructional materials like rubrics, things like that. But it should never, ever replace that human piece. So again, AI might suggest grades, feedback, or instructional strategies, but final decisions must remain with the educators. AI should enhance professional judgment, not replace it. So when it comes to grading, discipline, recommendations, things like that, it's all stuff that it can help with professional judgment, but should never take it over. Transparency in AI use. This is a really interesting one because it's something that not a lot of people can agree on. This is something that it doesn't seem maybe like it's a big deal, but at the end of the day, guidelines have to be created in this area because there is no traditional, it hasn't been around long enough for there to be a traditional understanding of how to declare transparency or how to cite AI, things like that. Districts should be clear and upfront about how AI is used in education. Teachers, students, and parents should know when AI generated content is being used. And again, going back to the idea of citing your sources, I have heard everything should be cited that's AI. If AI has been used, it should be like from a direct citation to just notating that it's being used, to all the way to the other side of the spectrum where it's like AI is being used so often, why would we cite every single thing we're doing? So I've heard it across that whole thing. And so that's why it's important to create guidelines for this, because that way in a world where people can't agree on this, we need to say what is important to us. When is it important to us that our students, our teachers are citing their use of AI? AI decisions should be explainable, so no black box. AI tools that provide outputs without clarity. And then why does that matter? Because AI should not be making invisible decisions about students ever. Everything should be very transparent when it's being used. A really common complaint that I've heard from students is that they are frustrated when teachers use AI for their feedback, but they're not allowed to use AI for their own learning. Like they're saying it's unfair, right? Like we're punished if we use AI, but teachers aren't actually reading our papers that we're not using AI on, and they're using AI to provide feedback. That's very frustrating for them. So how can we determine when AI can and cannot be used and then citing that appropriately? Some more additional guidelines for consideration: digital and media literacy for AI. Of course, this should be a required part of any kind of digital citizenship programs, but should definitely be being taught. Students need to be trained on how to fact check AI generated content. A lot of adults need to be trained on how to fact check generative AI content. It is getting harder and harder to figure out what it is that is and is not AI. But especially teachers should receive PD on evaluating AI outputs for bias and accuracy. Students also should learn this, but until teachers are taught it, we can't expect them to be teaching students. We need to make sure that kind of a PD is included. And because we need students to critically evaluate AI materials, and then many AI outputs sound authoritative, sorry, can't say this word right now, authoritative, but may be incorrect or biased. And this is, AI always reminds me of that person that you probably work with that says everything with confidence, but is usually wrong. But you question whether they're right or not because you know they've been wrong in the past, right? And so you're like, this person's been wrong in the past, but they said it with such confidence that they must know what they're talking about. That's what AI reminds me of. It will say everything with confidence, even when it's completely wrong. And so making sure that we can distinguish between when it is correct and when it is not. Ethical use of AI in assessment and grading. This goes back a little bit to what we were just talking about, understanding like when AI is allowed, is not allowed, and guidelines for grading. Okay. Oops. I think I accidentally made copies of this. Okay, there we go. So those are some guidelines that you can start with, that those at least should be considerations when you're thinking about creating those guidelines. And then step 3, before you even start writing your own guidelines, would be to review alternative guidelines, policies, guidelines, things that other districts have created, things that states have created in order to be able to create your own. There's no sense in starting over. Look at what other people have done, determine what is good, what do you like, what do you not like, what would you want to replicate, but look at those examples. There's nothing wrong with doing that. So I'm going to bring us back. These are the generative AI guidelines and principles that were from the School District of Philadelphia. Obviously, the guidelines that they came up with were, I think, 25 pages. They put them into a notebook LM for their teachers to be able to ask notebook LM questions and things about the guidelines so that they could access them from there. But this is just the areas that they looked at as they created their principles. And I do have the link to the entire Philadelphia guidelines as well at the end of the presentation that I'm going to provide for you. So you'll be able to see all of them. But what they have is pretty comprehensive. And the first thing that they started with was student-centered learning. AI should enhance, not replace, educators' roles. So we talked a little bit about that. They really leaned into it's meant to support teaching and learning, not meant to replace educators ever. As far as academic integrity and responsible use, AI should support learning, not replace student effort. So that same thing only flipped. We expect the human to be a piece of that all the time. And then AI literacy, we must help students and educators understand AI, how it works, and when to use it responsibly. And a lot of my work that I did with the School District of Philly for the last 2 years had been around AI literacy and helping everybody understand it from their complete administrative team, which is extensive. It's a big district, all the way down to the classroom and the teachers and the students. That was a lot of what we worked on. And so it was expected that everybody in that district have some sort of AI literacy, that they understand prompt engineering. And it didn't matter if you were the secretary at the front desk. It didn't matter if you were one of the maintenance people working in one of the warehouses. Like, you had the opportunity to learn about Gen AI and what was expected in that district. Professional learning. The School District of Philly is really great about professional learning, having the people in place in order to provide some of that. Again, part of my work there was to provide some of that professional learning. They wanted staff to be comfortable with the guidelines and to really understand them, but then also to be using AI ethically and to know what ethically meant in that district. Privacy and data protection. So they focused in on helping people understand that AI must comply with laws. And so that kind of went a little bit back to also understanding why it's important not to put PII into any kind of chatbot or generative AI, LLM, or whatever it is. And then as far as equity, inclusion, and accessibility, AI should support all students. And within the technology department's work, they also have like separate websites that give their teachers examples of what this would look like how can AI support these students and how can AI support these students. And so although it's not included in their guidelines, they did get really granular with it and help people understand how that looks in real practice. They also leaned hard into safety and well-being. AI should never replace that human connection in education. That was a really big message, was that education is about relationships. Generative AI cannot create those relationships like another human cannot provide like love and caring and all of those things that teachers do. And so we need to make sure that those AI is not replacing that in any way. And then continuous evaluation and improvement. They had a set time that AI policies would be regularly reviewed. Unfortunately, because AI is changing so quickly, that's something that has to be a part of AI guidelines, is that they need to be reviewed maybe every 6 months or every 3 months or something like that to make sure that they are still relevant, that they make sense. So That is a little bit tricky about the AI guidelines, is they have to be specific enough to guide people, but they have to be general enough to be able to allow for the change that's happening. So we have, trying to check the time here. We might have a little bit of time to go through some of the AI guidelines that I have provided. Going to be close, we'll see. But when you do get that sheet, here are some things that you can look for in AI guidelines. And of course, there is not a single example that I provide you that is going to be perfect. All of them are going to be created by humans, hopefully, that there are going to be pieces that you like. There's one, for example, that is very pretty. Okay, it is well put together. You look at it and you're like, wow, this is really impressive. I like how this looks. But when you start to really dig into some of the information that it provides, you might be like, oh, wait, actually, I'm not sure how I feel about this. So you have to really make sure that you're reading them and thinking about what the purpose of that document is. So for some things that you want to look for, one would be very clear definitions. You want to make sure that when you're creating your guidelines or you're looking at other guidelines, that the definitions that are provided are agreed upon by your team. Those are going to be your district definitions for what that looks like. Again, you want to make sure that anybody who's reading the guidelines who doesn't have a background in AI or even just technology understands what it is that they're reading. So you need clear definitions. So an example might sound like generative AI refers to tools that create text, images, or code based on user prompts. That's very clear. That's something we agreed upon. You want to look for where the human enters. We want to make sure that it says things like final grading decisions remain with certified staff. Okay. Transparency expectations. So that goes back a little bit to the how do we know when Gen AI is being used and when it's not? So students must disclose AI assistance in submitted work. Okay. I would go even further to agree upon how it's disclosed. Does it need to be a sentence at the end? Does it need to be actually submitted in APA style? Or is it up to the teacher to tell the students how they need to do that? One step further, it needs to be like how it's supposed to be done. Teacher use expectations. So like, how are teachers allowed to use it? How are teachers allowed to use AI in their classroom? So teachers may use AI to draft lesson plans, but must review for accuracy. Don't assume ever that people are going to do that on their own. Don't ever assume that people are going to look back at what has been, what the output has been, and critically analyze what it says. If you think about teachers and how busy they are and things that they have to do, that lesson plan that was just drafted might be like they're saving grace for that day and they're just going to do it as is printed out, right? You want to make sure that they understand that they must be reviewed prior to use. That's another piece of just keeping the human in the loop, like making sure that they have that they are understanding that they need to review that. And then finally, that equity language is included. So things like AI tools will be evaluated for accessibility and bias before approval. I think one of the things that I see districts doing a lot of is making sure that they are at minimum kind of narrowing in on an AI tool to use. There has been, when I just did this session at IdeaCon a couple weeks ago, when I talked to the districts that were in the session, a lot of them said teachers are allowed to use whatever they want to use. However, a lot of them were also, even before they had guidelines, they were looking at tools that they wanted to hone in on. I do think we're getting better at that, providing guidance on that. Okay, things that we should watch out for. Blanket bans. Anything that says AI use is prohibited in all classrooms. That's not helpful because it's not what's going to happen. So we need to make sure that when we provide guidance isn't just don't do it. Vague language, use AI responsibly. What does that mean? Using AI responsibly can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. It probably means different things to the people in this group. These participants that are in this place using AI responsibly means something different. So we need to make sure that we are specific when we say something. Watch out for no privacy clarity. If there's no mention of the importance of understanding FERPA or COPA or any kind of student data guards, make sure that you're looking for that. Any kind of lack of instructional clarity, something like students may not use AI without defining what counts as use. Yes, you need to get that specific, okay? You need to assume throughout this whole thing that, that there's no understanding of what AI is and how to use it. And so being vague is not going to be helpful. And then no stakeholder voice. The policy is written by IT only. I've seen a couple policies like that. IT has gone to some generative AI tool. It has said, give me some AI guidelines for schools, and it's popped it out, and they have copied it and pasted it into a document and call it their guidelines. No, it needs to be something that is collaborative, that we have all stakeholders' voices in it, and that it can be not just something that's there so you can say you have guidelines, but that it can actually be useful to people and protect people in the space. Okay, so I think we have a few minutes. Sarah, is that true?
Yeah, I think we still have about 10 minutes remaining in this session.
Okay, so let's do this. Before I give you the AI guidelines to take a look at, I'd love you to go into the chat and just say something that kind of resonated for you, or something you're going to take from this session. Thanks, Rodney. I'm glad. That is probably the best thing to take out of this. Our policy is being adjusted, says it was top down only and no stakeholders involved. Good. I'm glad that they are doing that. And I do think some districts did that just for time purposes, because things were like moving so quickly. I've heard some people get like some temporary guidelines in place while they go through the kind of longer process of that. There are too many AI guidelines around the world. It is confusing. That's why it's important for districts to determine what it is that they want and what they're comfortable. Leslie says, I would like to see us involve students in drafting guidelines. I think that one of the most common things I see with the drafting guidelines is that the students and the parents are not involved. And I think that's done partially because we don't trust our students to have a valuable opinion sometimes, and that it takes time to involve parents, but it's really important to do. Stephanie said, great reminder to review guideline policies often. Yes, unfortunately for these, they have to be, just because things are changing so quickly. I'm hoping at some point it slows down and we can review it like normal guidelines. Let's see, being specific on guidelines, teams make decisions, absolutely. Lots of great practical ideas. Good, I'm glad. So as long as everybody gets just one thing out of this presentation, that always makes me happy. So thank you so much for that. I do appreciate it. I think what I'm going to do is, just for time purposes, I'm going to give you the link to the guidelines, and you guys can take a look at those later. So this is we have the QR code here. It's just going to take you to a document with some links. Again, they are not the guidelines that are there. I am not saying at all are good examples. I think you can learn just as much from bad examples as you can from good examples. That's why it's really important to think about what's important for your guidelines, what is important to your district in order as you're creating your guidelines or even reviewing your guidelines. Maybe you guys already have some in your district and the 6-month review comes up and you look at them and you go, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? This is not at all what we really meant when we were writing these. Really making sure that you have a very common understanding about what the vision for use of AI is in your district, and then moving forward from there. But these guidelines, again, I'm not saying that they are excellent examples. They are a mix. They are also a mix of policy and guidelines. So you can see the difference between those as well. So as you bring those up, you'll be able to, it'll say policy and guidelines. It'll tell you which one it is. Any other questions or anything else? Let's see. Do you think the AI guideline is a kind of specific one for a specific college? Can you give me more information about that? Are you saying, do you think that AI guidelines should be standard for colleges?
Hi, can I speak and explain that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Aladdin, and I'm a professor in Toronto, in Canada, and I teach in the post-secondary. For the AI guidelines, I don't know if this does make sense, but does what works in the US work in Canada, for example? Does what works in a specific college, for example, whether it's chemistry or whatever? I teach, for example, AI and cybersecurity and high tech like the blockchain, cloud computing, cybersecurity. Can we have some kind of examples? What's the standardized AI policy that can fit here and there for a specific mainstream like cybersecurity, for example, or cloud, or blockchain, or quantum computing? Because I'm working on these topics. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. My opinion on the guidelines is that your guidelines are going to tell a teacher how they can use it and a student how they can use it. So it's going to be focused more on the learning and less on the topic that you're teaching. Not the only way, probably the most obvious way that I can see that there would be a difference in the guidelines depending upon a class would be in the expected transparency of the use of AI. And that just is because some disciplines require MLA and some require APA and some don't really have an expectation. That would probably be the area of the biggest difference. But because the guidelines are focused on how you as a teacher are using them and how students are allowed to use them or encouraged to use them, it's not going to matter so much the class content, like the topic of it. It's more about the learning. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure. And I apologize. I don't know what Canada has in place as far as AI guidelines from like at the government level. I don't know if they've put anything in place. I thought I heard something about it, but it's possible that it was only K-12 schools. But if there was something put out, then it might be worth taking a look at what they provided as well.
Thank you, Mandy. You alert me with a question. If we, for example, if we develop a specific AI policy for a college, because I teach in different colleges, so does that have to be like a kind of approved from the ministry or the government or the provisional, for example, government?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, I'm not entirely sure about Canada, but policies in here are usually, they don't have to be approved by a government entity, but the policies are usually written in conjunction with like our Board of Education and a lawyer. So like in districts, when policy is created, it's usually written and then it's looked at by a lawyer to make sure that everything's good and right and legal and things like that. Guidelines are different. So like, for example, if I worked with a district, I would not help them create policy because I don't know enough about the law, those types of things in order to be able to do that with them. But I could help them create guidelines because guidelines are just about taking the policy that's in place and telling people how it works in real life. So you could create it here in the US, you could create guidelines without getting it like running it up the chain, but you could not create policy that same way. But again, that's in the US, so I'm not sure about Canada.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Mandy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gonna create AI policy for AI and cybersecurity and quantum because these three main topics are converging now, and it's a very hot one, and it's very highly recommended and required. Guys, how the students are engaging in all of these AI, the cybersecurity part of AI and the vulnerabilities and the types of the threats and attacks, and how we can integrate that with the national policy of quantum computing, because now there are many. For example, in Canada, we have one. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, so another question. Why do people still feel uncomfortable using AI tools? Why do they feel that if one uses any of it, it's somehow less intelligent? I think that I'm just taking a guess on this. And if anybody else wants to pipe in, please unmute yourself or answer in the chat, because I think this is a really interesting question. I think of AI very similarly to how we used to think of the internet or and just really computers in general. Like when something first comes out, people don't understand it and they are sometimes scared of it, right? And so I think at the basic human level, when people don't understand and they only hear what's going on in news articles and they hear about students taking their own life because their AI friend didn't like them anymore or whatever it was, they hear these really scary things and it just perpetuates that fear. So I think that when it comes to using AI, like I know I can tell you, I have a brother-in-law who he is legitimately afraid of robots taking over the world. I'm not talking about like a haha, have you seen the robots that they say are taking over the world? Like they can barely stand up and do it. I'm not talking about that where we laugh about it. I'm talking about where he is legitimately afraid of that. And so when he hears AI, he does not hear ChatGPT. He does not hear productivity. He doesn't hear the assistance that generative AI can give to people with ADHD and things like that. He doesn't hear that. What he hears is that AI robots are that much closer to becoming a thing. Okay. And so when that robophobia, is that honestly what it's called, Rodney? When they hear stuff like that, it's again, it's a little bit of not like a misunderstanding. They don't really understand what it is. And if you fear something, sometimes you also make up other things that justify that fear, right? If I'm going to fear AI, I'm going to also say things that justify me not using it. People who use AI aren't as smart as other people. And then they're going to also cite studies that have been done about people's brains changing because of the use of AI. And so whenever you fear something, you're going to go down the path of trying to justify that fear. So I think that's where that comes from a little bit. Chris said it's always FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's where that comes from. Okay, so we are at time, and thank you so much, everybody, for participating. I hope that you found that helpful. I really appreciate your questions and your comments. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
All right, Mandy, thank you so very much. That was amazing. Can y'all show her some love in the chat, please?
She Thanks, just everyone.
Rocked it out. So much appreciation to Mandy.